Well, folks, our next speaker is the editor-in-chief of RedState.com, the most widely read right-of-center blog on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. The Hollywood Reporter calls him the most influential conservative blogger on the internet. His morning briefing email is widely considered a must-read among conservative pundits and activists, and his radio show is heard on the nation's most listened-to talk radio station, WSB of Atlanta, Georgia. He's also co-author of the book Red State Uprising. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Erick Erickson.
I see how it is. They put the guy with the face for radio and the voice for print after the Benham brothers, and now you're stuck with me. You know, normally I can tell a few jokes, but I've been thinking about what to tell you guys today, and I've been listening to the speeches today. You know, the Benham brothers are right. There's just something amiss right now in the country. There's a hostility, and a lot of people waking up wondering, well, how did things go so wrong so quickly? How are our voices able to be driven from television? I want to explore that with you for the next few minutes. You know, we are here at the Values Voter Summit, and we have values, and I will tell you my values come from a belief in a guy who died and 3 days later came back to life. Those are where my values come from. And more I encounter people who say, that's a myth. That's nonsense. Science can't prove it. There are many things science can't prove. People who have turned creation into their God instead of worshiping the actual creator, they've turned things upside down. So nowadays, in the United States of America, who you sleep with is something you're born with, and whether you're a boy or a girl is something you can decide. There are people out there who think that's normal. They've turned the world upside down. They say it's a mythology. They say it's not real. You know, let me tell you about some people. There's a guy named Ignatius, many of you have heard of. There's a guy named Polycarp. There's a guy named Irenaeus. Irenaeus was an early church leader. He lived and died in France, and he studied under two men, Polycarp and Ignatius. We know that they existed because Irenaeus existed. We know that he existed. We know when he died, he wrote about himself. He wrote about them. Polycarp and Ignatius existed. We know they existed because they wrote about themselves and they wrote about the guy who taught them. We know when they died. We know they existed. And Polycarp and Ignatius, they tell us their teacher was a guy named John. And they tell us that John was the best friend of a guy named Jesus. Then there's this other guy, Clement. Clement lived in Italy. Clement wrote a lot about faith. Clement said that this guy John existed. He said this guy Peter existed. He said some guy named James existed who was Jesus' half-brother. You got to write a lot of people out of history to say Jesus didn't exist. You got to write a lot of people out of history. You got to write more people out of history than you would for Socrates, who himself never wrote. That's one of the things they say. Well, if Jesus was alive, surely he would have written something. Socrates never wrote anything. There are more people, first-hand accounts of people who knew Jesus than who knew Socrates. So then what of Jesus? Let me tell you, some of you here think you can sit on the sidelines. I coined this phrase a while back in the Battle Over Gay Marriage called, you will be made to care. Let me explain to you. Some of you think you can sit on the sidelines. Some of you think the gay marriage fight, it doesn't affect you. You will be made to care. Some of you think that you can sit on the sidelines over this worship between creator and creation. You will be made to care. Some of you think you can sit on the sidelines on the battle of life. It doesn't affect you. You're not married. You don't have kids. You will be made to care. The world will make you choose. Do you know which side you're on? Let me tell you about three guys. Their names were James and Simon and Judas. We call him Jude for reasons that'll become obvious. They were, some say, Jesus' first cousins, others his half-brothers. And they thought he was nuts. Think about that. They thought he was nuts. Mark tells us that they tried to stage what we would call today an intervention. They would get a reality show on A&E for an intervention. They actually showed up with their mom, Mary. And they told the crowd that Jesus was nuts. And they said they wanted him to come out. Think about this. A woman who had an angel appear to her, say she was going to be with the Son of God, showed up, staged an intervention, said he's nuts. She knew he could turn water to wine, but said he was nuts, tried to get him out of the crowd. His brothers thought he was nuts. Mark documents this. Matthew documents this. Matthew, an eyewitness. Mark, the writings of Peter, also an eyewitness. They thought he was nuts. They wanted an intervention. And then John, his best friend, documents that during the Feast of Booths one year, his brothers told Jesus, you know what, if you think you're such a hot shot, go to the big city. Get out of town. We're tired of you. So he did. What happened? He was crucified. He was tortured, nailed to a cross, and died. And we know from Matthew, an eyewitness, the writings of Peter through Mark, an eyewitness, through John, an eyewitness, and through Luke, who investigated and interviewed everyone, we know who didn't show up at his execution. His brothers. They thought he was a nut. They were tired of him. They told him to get out of town. They didn't show up at his own execution. In fact, we know from John, Jesus from the cross before he died had to tell his mom, here's your son, and had to tell John, here's your mom, take care of her. Because his brothers didn't show up. And then he died. If that was all there was, we probably wouldn't be here. There probably wouldn't be a values voter summit. I'll tell you what else there wouldn't be. There wouldn't be a phrase we know well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That phrase wouldn't exist. That phrase does not exist but for the prior phrase, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You can't get to one but for the first. So if he died and that was it, well, that's all there was. So then why then in Acts does it say that his brothers, the very brothers who thought he was nuts, who threw him out of town, who wouldn't show up at his execution, why were they members of the early church? Well, Paul tells us that Jesus appeared to his brother James, not as a ghost, but as a real living person. James became a leader in the early church. Paul tells us that James, the brother who wouldn't even show up at Jesus' execution, became a pillar along with John and Peter of the early church. James believed. And we know that in about 67 AD, the leaders in Jerusalem went to James, who was very respected in his community, and said, will you tell people this is nonsense? You didn't believe him when he was alive. You didn't show up at his execution. Will you tell people this is nonsense? People are still, we've killed him, and people are flocking to him. Now, they had killed a lot of people claiming to be the Messiah, and those people didn't keep getting followers. But for some reason, this guy did. And so his brothers are alive. Now, people tell us all the time, I hear it in church, no one would die for a lie. You better believe people will die for a lie. 17 men flew planes into tall buildings in New York City over a lie. We would die for a lie. The people who won't die for a lie are the ones who know the liar the best. They're not going to die for a lie. So they go to James. You didn't believe him in life. You wouldn't show up at his execution. Tell him. And he said he was wrong. That it turned out his brother wasn't really his brother afterwards, but was alive and a living God. And the leaders picked him up and carried him to the top of the temple wall, and they threw him off. And laying battered and bruised and bleeding and broken on the ground, he was proclaiming that his brother was really God, and they stoned him to death. And you know what happened after that? His brother Simon stood up and took his place in the church. Simon was later disemboweled. And when Simon died, his brother Jude stood up and took his place. The brothers who wouldn't show up at his execution, the brothers who said he was nuts, the brothers who with their mother tried to stage an intervention, they were all willing to die after his death to say that he hadn't actually died, that he was alive, that he had died and had come back to life. 2 of those brothers wrote books of the Bible. And then what of those who came after them? What of Polycarp and Ignatius, who studied under his best friend John? Polycarp refused to provide provide incense. Sorry, wrong century. He refused to provide incense and burn it for the emperor, so they burned him at the stake as incense to the emperor. His friend Ignatius was lit in on a spit into the Colosseum, disemboweled, and while still alive, the emperor set live animals on him to eat him alive. Clement was tied to an anchor and thrown into the ocean. These men might not have known Jesus, but they knew all of Jesus' best friends. They were convinced that he was real. Chesterton said, "We can reason all day, but at the end, it's faith that matters." I've given you that entire story because of this. The ones who knew Jesus best said it was real. They said the resurrection was real. The eyewitnesses, there were eyewitnesses. They said it was real. Paul, in I believe it was Philippians, says, you can ask. There are 500 brothers, some still alive. So the eyewitnesses could be asked. Luke interviewed them. He wrote his book. He wrote 2 books. Luke became not just a documenter, but also became a participant. Friends, if the resurrection matters, marriage matters. If the resurrection was real, life matters. If the resurrection was real, we have a purpose. And we live in a day and age where there are a whole lot of people who tell us we don't have a purpose. The arguments couldn't be more clear in this age when so many people worship science as the end of all things. There are some who believe we were an accident of primordial goo. Particles bumping into each other after the Big Bang, creating bacteria that created amoeba, that created something that led to something that led to something, a missing link. And then men. Somewhere in there, there's a monkey, apparently. But we're an accident. And if we're an accident, we have no purpose. Or our purpose is pleasure. The highest and best use of mankind is pleasure. To maximize pleasure and minimize pain. That was a Roman philosopher of the first century. Sounds like somebody you'd hear today on that Cosmos series on Fox. We either don't have a purpose and are an accident, or we do have a purpose. I would submit to you we have a purpose. I would submit to you we have a purpose because we were created in the image of living God. And I would submit to you, if we have a purpose and we are created in the image of God, then we will care. We must care. And I would submit to you that we must not just care on Sunday from 11 to noon, or nowadays some of you trendy people in churches go from 10:30 to 11:30. I don't get it. Or 10:30 to 12 if you've got a long-winded preacher. We keep a clock at the back of our church so the preacher can't go long. But it must matter more than Sunday. It must matter Monday through Saturday as well. It must matter in our lives. It must matter in the way we raise our children. It must matter in the way we approach the world. It must matter in our politics. If the resurrection is real, it must matter 24/7, 365. And I believe it's real. I believe it is real. And I see in this world a world that is becoming increasingly hostile to it. I see a world that is opposed to us in this room because we're headed home to eternity. We're just passing through. But while we're passing through, my parents always told me we've got an obligation to make this place better than when we left it. Better does not mean leaving people to moral relativism. Better does not mean leaving people to their own devices. Better does not mean telling people you got no purpose or go find your own purpose. Better means telling people there is a future, there is a last day, and there is a side. Pick a side and the right side wins. Better means love, but not the love of this world. I would submit to you, if you really love in the way Christ tells us to love, you got to love someone enough that you don't want them to go to hell. I would submit to you that. I would submit to you when the world tells you that's not loving, that's judging. I would submit to you that there are standards for life, and none of us can reach them. But that doesn't mean we should stop trying. And then I want to leave you with this point. There are many, 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 many people who died before us for what we believe. And there will be people tomorrow, somewhere in the world, who will die because of it. There will be people who will lose their heads, physically lose their heads because they believe what we believe. And it will probably not be anyone in this room. I read a theologian once, though, who said, if you've never been persecuted in some way, small or large, you probably need to question your faith. Christianity is a religion of persecution. It doesn't mean you're going to lose your head. It doesn't mean you're going to lose your life. But will you lose your job? Will you not get a TV show? Will they try to drive you from your TV show? Will they try to tell you you can't vote? Will they try to tell you you can only believe from 11 to 12 on Sunday? If you believe that a man died on a cross, was buried, and 3 days later came to life, you have an obligation to go into culture. A lot of my friends want to withdraw from culture. They want to take their kids, they want to build a high wall. They want to homeschool, nothing wrong with homeschooling, but they want to build a high wall, they want to homeschool, they want to cut the cable, they want to not have a telephone, they want to withdraw from culture. If you believe in the resurrection, you must go forth. You must go forth. You must go into culture. You must go into hell that is humanity and bring people out and rescue them. You must be willing to save people. You must be willing to love people. You must be willing to engage a culture that doesn't want to engage you but wants to hate you. And you cannot hate back. You must. Now see, I'm not a politician. I've still got time and I'm wrapping up. You must be willing to engage in the public square. You must be willing to care. And those of you who think you can sit on the sidelines, you're going to be made to care. The butcher, the baker, the photographer, the candlestick maker, some of them didn't want to care, and they were forced to care. You will be forced to care. The question is, how will you care? Which side will you be on? There may be people here who are Democrats. God forgive you. There may be people here who are liberals. We will pray. But you need to understand there is a right and a wrong. There is a real truth and there is a lie. And the lie is that you have no purpose. The lie is that your life ends and there is no more. There is an eternity. There is a God and we are headed home. And there will be a day of judgment. And when you get to that day of judgment, your sins will be forgiven if you believe. But God will want to know, what did you do in this lifetime? Did you go forth? Did you go into the culture? Did you reach down and try to pull someone out of the mass? Did you look at the person who Neil deGrasse Tyson and all the Discovery Channel alien shows told them they have no purpose in life and the aliens are coming to get them and tell them that no, Jesus is? When you go out into culture, and we will go out into culture, the world will try to get you to shut up or change your mind. We must hold firm and fast and know that neither the heights nor the depths nor death nor angels nor principalities nor princes can separate us from Christ. And that should make us bold, and that should make us courageous, and that should make us willing to go into the town square and tell people we're not going anywhere. Tell people that there is a right way. Tell people there is a truth. Tell people we're headed home. And tell people they can come with us. And we should not be fearful. We should not grow weary, though weariness sets in. If the resurrection mattered, what we're doing here matters, because our values come from that. And our values should not be silenced. They should not be driven away. What you and I should do is get into culture. Get into the town square and get into the ballot box and get into elections and get into office and shape the culture as best we can. And if we're not fortunate, if we're not one of the people, I was an elected official for a while, it was the most painful experience of my life. I encourage you to avoid it unless you're one of those people who desperately wants it. But if you get in, get in. Do it with a burning fire for righteousness. And do it knowing that all these people who came before us, they were willing to die. His brothers were willing to die. Their friends were willing to die to say he was real. Can you say he's real? Can you tell others he's real? And can you do it with love? I think you can. I think we will. And I think though the world may deal us setbacks and we may be depressed and we may look at us, oh Lord, 2 more years of Obama. It's only 2 more years. We've got an eternity. Thank you very much.